Before becoming the single most racist president of the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson was a racist professor at Princeton, and Professor Wilson was one of the first American intellectuals to speak of democratic norms. Wilson said a few years after the Civil War that the American Constitution is important, but what really keeps America glued together is its normative behavior. Now, I know that we're never going to outlaw private schools in America. But since the Supreme Court's 1954 ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, there's been a backlash, a new norm, and that new norm is public schools bad, private schools good. Homeschooling good, public schools bad. Well, it's the 21st century. Try to imagine a new norm. And we may be heading there due to so many Americans racking up massive debt. A new norm where private schools are demonized the same way public schools are being demonized right now. Imagine a new norm where everyone sends their kids to a public school, and the same parents who once identified with the ruling class finally get real, decide we're all in this together, and roll up their sleeves and fix our public schools because that's where their kids go. Imagine a new norm where it finally dawns on the people who think they can afford $35,000 a year to send one child to private school. Imagine a new norm where it dawns on these people that their child would actually benefit more if that $35,000 a year were spent on an entire public school classroom. Some of these private schools are $40,000 a year. That's a public school teacher's salary. Now, you want to send your kid to a private school and you think you have the money for that? That's fine. But don't tell me that it's a level playing field here in the United States. Don't tell me Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh got into Yale because he worked hard. Brett Kavanaugh spent 4 years at Georgetown Prep. And while he was busy holding women down and covering their mouths so they wouldn't scream, his parents were coughing up $40,000 a year to send him to Georgetown Prep. That's a $160,000 high school education. That's what they spent to get him into Yale. So don't tell me you worked hard, Brett Kavanaugh, and that it's a level playing field. So with income and wealth inequality way past the tipping point, try to imagine where college-educated parents who identify with the ruling class realize they can no longer afford to send their Brett Kavanaughs to private school anymore. And the new norm in America is public schools good, private schools bad. What kind of America would we then be looking at if that becomes the new norm, where people are proud to send their kids to public schools? For more on this, we're going to the land of the striking public school teachers, Los Angeles. Professor Pedro A. Noguera is a professor of education over at UCLA. His most recent book is Race, Equity, and Education, The Pursuit of Equality in Education, 60 Years After Brown. It's published by Springer Press. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Dave.
You write over at The Nation that many consider the Los Angeles teachers' strike a pivotal moment where we're not talking about salaries or even class size. We're talking about the future of public education. But first describe for me, if you will, an America where we don't hive off children inside private schools, where we have a thriving public school system, where we treat the schools the way we treat the Pentagon, where we think, sure, it's impossible to audit, but hey, if occasionally we have to spend $7,000 on a coffee pot, who cares? We're talking about our children's future. It's important. So spend the money, waste it like it's a B-1 bomber. Can you picture an America like that? What would it look like?
I want to just challenge some of what you said in the beginning, because almost 90% of Americans send their kids to public schools now. That America that you describe, where most people rely on public schools, is already with us in most suburban and rural areas, where the vast majority of people put their kids in public schools. It's in our cities where we see this distinct pattern where affluent people have their kids in private school, working class and poor people have their kids in public schools. So that's really an urban phenomenon, not a national phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for pointing that out.
The reason why every time there's been a ballot measure for vouchers, it's been defeated. And the reason why it's defeated is because most Americans are pretty satisfied with their public schools. So although the media may not project that, it's a little bit like Congress. Most Americans like their congressman, even though they hate Congress. Most Americans like their public school, even though they think the state of public education is not very good.
Is that because the media sends their kids to private schools and the lawmakers all send their kids to private schools, so they don't even know that the public schools are actually fine?
It's a case where the elites in our country, particularly in urban areas, send their kids to private schools, and that's part of elite status, is getting your kids into elite private K-12 schools and then into colleges. In New York City, they even have what they call baby Ivies, elite preschools, that people wait in long lines and clamor to get their kids into because they believe that these preschools are the gateway to Harvard. But that's, again, really an urban phenomenon, less of a suburban or rural phenomenon.
Okay, so we see the public school teachers in Los Angeles going on strike. They're not just striking for money. You write that they're striking for the future of public education in Los Angeles. How is Los Angeles different than, say, suburban schools? I actually think of Los Angeles as suburbia, the way it's so sprawling. So how is Los Angeles different than your typical urban area?
Well, I think what's different is that it's in California. And although California is a liberal blue state, it's in education, it's much more like a red state, right? We don't spend money on public schools, so we compete with places like Alabama and Mississippi for at the bottom of the rankings per pupil spending, which doesn't seem to make sense unless you understand our history since Prop 13 in 1978 and the way that basically took money out of public education, because we were once one of the top-ranked states. So Los Angeles, in many ways, epitomizes what's wrong, because we have some of the largest class sizes in the nation, and in a district that serves overwhelmingly low-income kids of color, money makes a huge difference, because not only are the class sizes large, but we don't have enough counselors, we don't have the kind of supports that kids need. Even special ed students that we know need more time and attention are not getting that in Los Angeles. So we have a number of problems that I would attribute largely to the state's disinvestment in public education.
Are you saying that there is a crisis in our public schools when it comes to urban areas, but the suburban schools are fine?
No, I don't want to suggest at all that they're fine. I would say, though, that the crisis is most acute in urban areas. There are a lot of suburban districts that are struggling, too, and so I don't want to suggest that, we don't have to be concerned. I mean, in the teacher strikes in West Virginia and Oklahoma, for example, those are not states with large urban sectors. And you will find, in Oklahoma, kids were going to school 4 days a week because they had stopped the funding and they couldn't afford to keep them in schools 5 days a week. So we have a huge problem across the country, especially in red states, of underfunding public education. The real question is, why is California one of those states?
Just so I understand what you taught me, the crisis in the urban areas is because of white flight or the meritocracy leaving and sending their kids to private schools, leaving behind low-income parents in the public schools. That's the crisis we're seeing in the urban areas, in blue states primarily. And then when you look at the red states, there are school systems in crisis because they are implementing austerity statewide, and they've decided not to spend money on our schools.
That's right.
That's what's going on.
And I would say, there's more to it, but that's the big, the big story, right? Which is that we have not continued to invest. So the analogy I would make for the listeners is, in the 1970s, New York City was going bankrupt. And there was serious talk at that time of basically privatizing the subway system because they couldn't afford to sustain it. Anybody who knows New York in the 1970s knows that it had a lot of crime, graffiti everywhere. It was a total mess. And they said, we can't afford it, and we need to either get rid of it or sell it off, something. And business leaders came together and said, no way. There's no way the city can survive without a mass transit system that serves 4 million people a day. And so that system was saved. And in many ways, that should be the metaphor for public education. You know, as a New Yorker, I know that no matter where you take that subway, you're going to pretty much get in the same kind of subway car, pay the same rate, and it's going to be relatively safe and relatively clean.
Right.
Relatively, that is.
For the same price.
That's not the way it works in public education. In public education, if I live in Compton or if I live in Watts, I'm going to get a very different education than if I live in Beverly Hills or Bel Air.
Let me poke some more holes in my opening statement. I said that if rich people sent their kids to public schools, we might have a better public school system. But the truth is, if all the rich people in Manhattan sent their kids to public schools, Manhattan would have great public schools, but that would have no effect on the Bronx or Queens.
I want to agree with part of that. I think that when affluent people are in the system, then they advocate for the system to maintain standards and to maintain quality. The real question then is, will that system serve everyone?
So was that what the Burger Court was trying to accomplish with busing?
To some degree, yes. Because if we can we know that when the middle class, I mean, this is even Thurgood Marshall's reasoning around Brown. Racial integration was important because we knew that money follows white kids. And that when you have your kids in school with middle-class white kids, there'll be more resources available to kids. And so a big part of the reason why integration is important is for equity and access to resources. Now, the challenge is that, because we're seeing this playing out in New York right now, New York is going through rapid gentrification, and some of those affluent white families that are moving back into the city want their kids in public schools, but they don't want them to go to school with poor kids of color. So there's a big effort now to try to keep schools integrated or to integrate them, and there's a big pushback from affluent white gentrifying parents.
The white gentrifying parents are trying to send them to special public schools.
They would like them to be in basically exclusive public schools because it's cheaper, and even some of them want to save some money. But what they don't want is to have them sitting next to kids from the projects.
Is that why we have charter schools?
Charter schools is largely an urban phenomenon, too. Most people who live in suburban communities have never heard of a charter school, don't know what one is. Charter schools mostly serve poor kids of color. There are a few exceptions in places where charter schools have been used to kind of placate whites who didn't want to participate in integrated schooling. But for the most part, in Los Angeles, most of our charter schools are serving poor Black and Latino kids. Now, in many cases, they're also more segregated than our public schools, but they're not serving the affluent, which is one of the reasons why it's interesting. Many of the people who back charter schools would never put their own kids in there. And that's because in terms of the quality of what they offer, it's very uneven. It's nothing like the elite private schools where affluent people put their kids now.
Okay, so help me out, Professor, because a lot of this is complicated. Because our Constitution doesn't provide for a national education. They've left it up to the states. So we have 50 different types of education, and then each state has their local municipalities deciding how to educate. So there's a glossary of terms that I find confusing.
Sure.
I know that charter schools are bad, that they're supported by evil billionaires who want to make money off the tax dollars that are spent on public schools, and the charter schools are anti-union, and they don't test as well as public schools do. You just told me something that I didn't know, that more people of color are served by charter schools than white people. I didn't know that in Los Angeles.
That's right. And in fact, I don't take the position that charter schools are inherently bad. Many charter schools are serving kids that were not well served by the public schools. And parents who are unsatisfied with what their kids are receiving, who feel their kids are in unsafe schools or where they're not getting good education, will flee to charter schools if they feel they're better. I think the real problem is not the choice that parents are making, because all parents want what's best for their kids. The real problem is the way the system has allowed charter schools to exacerbate the inequities. Because what happens in many charter schools is that they are selective. about who they'll serve. They won't serve, for example, kids with learning disabilities.
Right.
And they don't say that you're not admitted. They just simply don't provide the services. So those kids are going to be in the public schools. They won't serve English learners in great numbers, although there are some that specialize with those kids. So you have to be careful about generalizing. So there's really a very diverse array of charter schools out there. Some charter schools, I think, are essential. We know, for example, that formerly incarcerated youth are not well served by our public schools. They typically don't want those kids. Well, a charter school that's able to attract teachers who want to work with those kids often has a better chance of serving them well. So the question is not whether or not we have charters that function outside the system. Its question to me is, are they accountable to the public that funds them for how they serve the kids and how they treat the staff, particularly the teachers? And what's the strategy behind charters? If you allow charters, as they have in Los Angeles, we have more charters than we possibly need because many of them are under-enrolled. And now we have many under-enrolled district schools. So we have too many schools. So what was the point of this authorizing so many charter schools way beyond the demand or much less the need? And that's part of the problem we have now in Los Angeles because Los Angeles has lost about 100,000 kids to charter schools over the last 15 years.
For our international listeners, check that. My international listeners probably know what charter school means because they pay more attention to what's going on in America than Americans do. So for my American listeners, define what a charter school actually is. And I have a lot of educators in my family. They hate charter schools. They think it's, and I agree with them, they think it's Republicans refusing to address the problems with public schools and actually wanting to destroy and privatize our public schooling. So define what a charter school is, and is it part of a movement just to eliminate public schools and turn it over to big business?
So charter schools are publicly financed but privately operated schools. And for many of your international listeners, that's the way education is provided, for example, in most of Europe and many parts of Africa and Latin America. That is, you can go to a publicly financed parochial school in many countries, for example, in France.
Really?
So charter schools are more like that. The real issue is that we have private foundations like Gates and Broad Foundation and Walmart that have seized upon charter schools as a solution because they're non-union. They regard the teachers' union as the biggest obstacle to change and what they call reform. And so they see charter schools as a way to undermine the union, which is why the UTLA sees the proliferation charters as a real threat to their existence.
And what is Eli Broad? He's the realtor in the Walmart family. Why do they have to get involved with our schooling? Just to destroy the public school teachers union? Is that their incentive, just to destroy a union?
You know, that's a good question. They would claim it's about getting kids into quality schools. But I think when you look at their political actions, for example, you look at the race for state superintendent, they overwhelmingly funded Marshall Tuck, who was seen as more pro-charter, to try to oppose Tony Thurmond, and they lost, despite the fact that much more money was spent on Marshall Tuck. And so they did the same thing in the District 4 race for school board in L.A., where Steve Zimmer was taken out and the pro-charter candidate, Nick Melvoin, was elected. So they've been taking measures for a while to try to put people in place who are sympathetic to their agenda, and with mixed results. And I think the tide is really turning against the billionaires that have been backing charter schools.
Bill Gates and the Walton family, who owns Walmart, they look at the pool of money spent on public education the same way Merrill Lynch would look at the pool of money that's sitting there in Social Security, and they want to privatize Social Security so they can get their hands on it. Is that their motivation? They see all this money waiting to be looted? Do they want to loot our tax dollars?
I think that's probably part of the agenda for some. It's hard to say Gates needs to make money off of public education because he's, second richest man in the world. So I think it would be a mistake to assume that that's the motive in every case. But yeah, there's a lot of money in education, and there are many private corporations that like to get hold of that money. And so I think the proliferation of charters and other efforts like promoting choice and vouchers is part of the effort to control what they regard as the monopoly of education that the public education system has had.
Now, all these billionaires went to private schools. They send their kids to private schools. And we're finding new studies that show children who go to elite private schools are more prone to drug addiction than children who go to public schools. Wouldn't these billionaires be better served fixing the private schools first before they come to where we are and try to fix our lives? Shouldn't they be fixing their own lives? It does upset me that people who don't send their kids to public schools think they know how to fix.
They can fix it, yeah.
It's complicated.
No, all the issues are complicated.
How much of this gets down to what I refuse to accept? That it's all about race, that race is intractable, and that when you cut through all the clutter, it gets down to people don't want to send their kids to school with people who are different.
I think that's a big part of it. We've seen whole systems change as integration proceeded, and we saw that particularly in several cities where that occurred. I think the only time it doesn't occur is when there's a consistent effort made to maintain high standards and high quality. Then you won't see as many middle-class people pulling out. So, for example, in many university towns, places like Berkeley, Cambridge, Ann Arbor, Durham, North Carolina, the schools are integrated, and they are still high quality. That is, affluent whites, well-educated, liberal, still put their kids in there. Now, they have other issues that we could talk about another time, but what they show is that when the standards are maintained, you can, in fact, continue to retain some degree of integration. Now, how you do that in cities, I think, is more complicated by residential segregation. But you have several cities, for example, the mid-city area of L.A. is relatively integrated. You could create integrated schools in Los Angeles if they were high quality, and we have proof that you can do that. There's a new school for girls that opened up right next to L.A. High called Gala, the Girls Academy for Language and something else. And it's a STEM school. It is now 3 years old. It has a waiting list, and it's racially integrated. People want their kids in there. And so it really is about ensuring high standards, high quality, and assuring parents that their kids will get a good education.
I just figured out why this makes me so angry. It's Los Angeles, which is the home of liberals. It's the home of all the Hollywood types who tell us how to live and preach tolerance and integration, but they don't practice it. That's why it's so aggravating to me, having raised my children in Los Angeles and worked in television in Los Angeles, and to see the hypocrisy. It really does give voice to the Breitbarts. You understand why they're so hostile to liberals, because most people who work in show business vote for Hillary, vote for Bernie, but they don't want to send their kids to a public school. And if they do have to send their kid to a public school, they'll move to Calabasas, not stay in Los Angeles. You brought up a school in Los Angeles that's exclusively for girls. It's a charter school exclusively for girls?
It's a public school.
A public school is a charter?
Yeah, no, it's just regular public school named after Michelle King, in fact, our former superintendent.
Okay. Historically black colleges and universities, they're still going strong. After Jackie Robinson played for the Dodgers, the Negro Leagues disappeared. But after Brown v. Board of Education, historically black colleges and universities continue to thrive. We're finding what you just spoke about. When you separate boys from girls, the girls do better at math and science. This is a nation of identity, unfortunately. We can't get past it. Our race, our religion, our sexuality, it's intractable. Do we have any clue as to what would happen if instead of high schools for performing arts, high schools for science, STEM, we had identity schools, what would happen if there was a public school in Los Angeles that was for LGBTQ students, or a school for African Americans, or for Christians? What if it was official Los Angeles policy to create quote unquote safe schools for people who lead with their identity?
So first, let me just correct what you said about the historically black colleges, because many of them are really struggling financially. And that's because those that are private have trouble attracting private dollars the way our big private universities do. And those that are public have been starved of resources by the state. So this is a huge problem across the South where most of the HBCUs are located. However, if those historically black colleges did not exist, we would, African Americans in this country would be in serious trouble. I'll give you an example. There's a small private college, Catholic college, black college, HBCU in New Orleans called Xavier. Little Xavier graduates more black students each year who are admitted to medical school than all of the Ivy League colleges and Stanford combined. So think about it. If you're just concerned about the need for black doctors, and we should be because black doctors are more likely to serve black patients, if you got rid of Xavier, you would significantly reduce the number of black doctors in the country. So HBCUs play a role. Now, to go to your question about identity and the way that is affected by choice, I think there are clear benefits, for example, to serving special populations that are vulnerable. So the Harvey Milk School was created in New York City to serve gay, lesbian, transgendered youth because many of those kids were depressed, suicidal, harassed, bullied, and the Harvey Milk School is seen as a national model. Does it mean that all gay, lesbian, transgender youth should go there? Absolutely not. But having a school like that can be a safe haven for those kids is critical. I think similarly, given that we live in a country that continues to be segregated, it's important, even as we try to create schools that are integrated, that we have high-quality schools that are serving the poor black and brown kids. So, for example, I could take you to a school in New York City, Medgar Evers Prep, where all the school kids are black, and it's an excellent school. Those kids are going to college. They do extremely well. Now, there are very few schools like that, not enough of them. Most schools that are serving mostly black or Latino kids are not very good. Unless we're going to really redouble our efforts to integrate schools, which I don't see happening anytime soon, then we've got to make sure that your neighborhood doesn't determine what kind of school you have access to. And right now, that is the case. If you grow up in Compton or Watts, you're going to have to leave town to get to a better school.
Yeah. If I ever run for office, I would insist that we create a new protected class called white trash. And you have to identify as white trash, which I know has racist origins. I know that calling yourself white trash implies that African Americans are worse. It's a prejudiced word. But if you identify as white trash, you then become a protected class and you can have your own school. You don't get to call yourself a white supremacist. Is it anything to that? I'm going to cut that out.
I don't know.
I always think I'm always trying to figure out, why people vote for Trump. And I think of poor white people who have no opportunity. And do they have any right to resent all this?
I think that there are, the story of poor white people across America is a story that's not really well told. There are a number of studies came out in the last couple of years trying to explain Trump's election that have explored this. Arlie Hochschild, for example, has explored, although I think she downplays the role that racism plays in shaping the politics of many poor white people. But poor whites across America are suffering. They are the ones experiencing a disproportionate share of this opioid crisis. I was in Vermont last summer speaking to principals. The number one issue they wanted to talk about was the opioid crisis. And Vermont is largely a white state. 60% of kids who graduate from high school in Vermont don't go to college. So poor whites in New England, poor whites in West Virginia, and many other parts of the country are experiencing severe hardships. They have a declining life expectancy. The only segment of the population right now with a declining life expectancy. And sadly, they've latched their hopes to a large degree onto Trump, at least those that vote. But I think that the fact is that in many cases they're hurting and haven't received their needs don't receive the attention they deserve.
Yeah, we had a governor of Maine. He's gone. He just
That's right. Thank God.
But he blamed the heroin addiction on African Americans coming up from New York, delivering the opioids and dropping off some semen to impregnate our girls. I mean, it's intractable. You have the Northeast corridor of Vermont and Maine, primarily white. They're addicted to heroin, and they're still blaming it on African Americans. I ask this of liberals and progressives. What do we do about white people? What are we going to do about them? And they don't. I hear white people saying, "Who cares?" But then I see Trump, and I go, "It has to be addressed." The disenfranchised. What do we do about disenfranchised white people, or who cares?
That's, I think, one of the big questions this country's got to address, because if they channel all their anger into resentments against people of color, which is what Trump has done, so much of the backlash against immigrants comes from poor whites who believe the rhetoric, that the immigrants are taking your jobs, even though most Americans don't want to do the work that immigrants are doing, or that immigrants are spreading crime. Those kinds of divisive politics, which we know historically have been very effective at keeping people divided and building white resentment, still work. And there needs to be, I think, and we had this at one time in this country, a progressive kind of outreach to poor white Americans that lets them to understand that they have much more in common with Black and Latino and Native American people than they do with the wealthy elites who like to try to manipulate them.
Professor, you're right that California is the world's fifth largest economy, but it's near the bottom of American states when it comes to spending on education. Then you point out immediately after that it spends so little on education and it houses the most prisoners in America. And that implies that there's a correlation between lack of spending on education and increased number of prisoners. I want to call you on this. If we blame the number of prisoners on lack of education, then aren't we letting the punitive nature of the criminal justice system off the hook? I mean, people of color are going to get arrested, especially in California, whether they're educated or not.
Well, I would say it's a question of priorities. We have, a limited amount of money in the public sector to spend on things we need, roads, healthcare, et cetera. What we've seen in California is as funding for prisons has gone up, funding for education has decreased. We went from, having a system of higher education that was the envy of the world to now spending more money on prisons than we do higher ed. Prison guards, for the longest while, have made more money than teachers. It's about choices and priorities. It costs about $235,000 a year to incarcerate a juvenile in L.A. County. We're spending about $10,000.
How much?
$235,000.
Say that again. I interrupted you. How much? How much?
$235,000 a year.
To do what?
To incarcerate a juvenile in L.A. County.
And
you can look it up.
and so is that done by private companies, or is that?
No. That's the county. I mean, it's a totally inefficient system because 2/3 of the young people we lock up will be back in less than 2 years. It's a system that is completely inefficient, but our policymakers have not figured out how to drain that swamp, right? How to take money out of the. I mean, I'm not one of those people who believe that abolition is possible. However, we could have a much more humane and just criminal justice system than we do right now that was less expensive and better at serving people. For example, if we educated people while they're in prison, they'd be much less likely to return. We've known that for many years. But we're prioritizing prisons at the expense of education. Jerry Brown made very, very small steps towards moving away from that. But hopefully Newsom's going to go much further. And the only way we're going to be able to move from 31st in the rankings in public education to doing a much better job is if we take the money from somewhere. And it can't just come from the reserve that he was left. It's going to have to come from that prison system.
Do we have unions fighting each other? Do we have prison guard unions fighting the teachers union over this money?
Sure, they're a lobby, and they're a very powerful lobby. And they endorse candidates too, just like the teachers do.
Wow. To be continued, I hope. I have to reevaluate a lot of what I thought was the answer. I thought I had the answer. Outlaw private schools. I've been.
That was actually Warren Buffett's.
Did Warren Buffett say that?
Suggestion. Yeah, he did. Or no, his idea was to send kids to school based on lottery. All kids go based on lottery.
And how did the lottery benefit the public schools in Los Angeles? Where'd all that lottery money go? Well, we've been talking with Professor Pedro A. Noguera. He is a professor of education at UCLA. You can read him over at The Nation. His most recent book is Race, Equity, and Education, The Pursuit of Equality in Education 60 Years After Brown. It's published by Springer Press. Thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Thank you. Nice being with you, David.
Can you stay on the line for 1 second?